There is a castle on the northern cliffs of a kingdom that no longer bothers to remember its own name, and in that castle there is a room that no servant is permitted to clean without the Duke standing in the doorway, watching as if the dust itself might steal something precious. Inside that room are shelves upon shelves of things that do not belong together in any collection a sane man would keep. A teacup with no handle, a violin missing 2 strings, a music box that plays half a song before it stutters into silence, a sword with a broken hilt, a painting torn clean down the middle and stitched back together with careful, ugly thread, a birdcage with a door that will not latch. Nothing in that room works. Nothing in that room is whole. And yet the Duke of Crestfall visits it every single night before he sleeps, the way other men visit a chapel, or a grave, or the memory of someone they loved and lost. They call him strange in the villages below the cliffs. They call him cold in the ballrooms of the capital, where he is seen perhaps twice a year, dressed in black, saying almost nothing, leaving before the dancing starts. They call him the collector of broken things, though never to his face, because the one time a merchant's son said it within earshot, the Duke did not raise his voice, did not so much as blink, and simply asked the boy, quite calmly, whether he had ever tried to fix something himself, or whether he only knew how to laugh at the people who tried. The boy did not answer. Nobody ever does when the Duke asks that question, because the truth is that most people throw broken things away. It is easier. A cracked plate goes in the bin. A torn coat goes to the ragman. A person who has been shattered by grief or cruelty or circumstance gets quietly, politely, permanently set aside, because mending is slow and painful and there is no guarantee, at the end of it, that the thing will ever be as good as new. The Duke of Crestfall never believed that. Not once, not for a single object in his strange and aching collection. And on the night this story begins, on a road slick with rain and thunder, 10 miles from his gates, he was about to find the one broken thing he had never planned to collect. A woman, half drowned, half frozen, cast out of a carriage that did not stop to see if she lived or died. He did not know her name yet. He did not know what had broken her or who. All he knew, kneeling in the mud with her cold hand in his, was that this, of all the things he had ever found, was the one he could not leave behind. Her name was Isadora. And by the time the story ends, you will understand why the Duke of Crestfall, a man who had spent his whole adult life mending teacups and violins and birdcages, would one day tell his own mother that mending Isadora had very nearly cost him everything he owned, and that he would have given every last broken thing in that terrible, beautiful room, if it meant he got to keep her. Stay with me, because this is not a simple love story. This is a story about what it means to be discarded, and what it means to be found, and whether 2 people who have both been broken by the world can somehow, against every reasonable expectation, put each other back together. To understand Duke Rowan of Crestfall, you first have to understand the house he was born into, because a man does not wake up one day and decide, out of nowhere, to fill his castle with broken things. Something teaches him that broken things are worth keeping. Something usually breaks him first. Rowan was the second son of the old Duke, which in most noble houses of that kingdom meant very little at all. Second sons were spares. They were sent to the military academy or the clergy, or married off to whichever family needed an alliance and didn't much care which brother they got, so long as the surname was right. Rowan's older brother, Alaric, was golden in every sense that mattered to their father. Tall, quick with a blade, quicker with a smile, the kind of young man who walked into a room and immediately became the reason everyone else was standing in it. Rowan, by contrast, was quiet, watchful. He noticed things other people didn't, which made him excellent company for very few people and mildly unsettling company for almost everyone else. Their mother, the old Duchess, used to say that Rowan had an old soul in a young body, and she meant it kindly, but their father heard it differently. Their father heard it as a diagnosis, a defect. He did not have patience for a son who preferred the company of books and broken clockwork to horses and swordplay, and he made that lack of patience known in ways that left no visible marks but plenty of invisible ones. When Rowan was 11 years old, his favorite thing in the world was a small wooden horse his mother had carved for him. Not bought, carved, with her own hands, over the course of a long winter when she had been too ill to leave her rooms and had needed something to do with her fingers besides worry about dying. The horse was not particularly fine work. One ear was slightly larger than the other. The paint had chipped within a month. But Rowan loved it the way children love things that were made specifically, only entirely for them, and he carried it everywhere until the day his father found him playing with it during a fencing lesson he was supposed to be paying attention to. His father did not shout. That was, in some ways, worse than shouting. He simply took the horse from Rowan's hand, turned it over once in his fingers as if inspecting a piece of evidence, and then threw it into the fireplace. Rowan tried to pull it out. He burned his hand doing it. A scar he still carries, faint and pale, along the outside of his left palm, and he did not manage to save the horse. What he saved, in the end, was a blackened stub of wood that no longer looked like anything at all. His father told him that was the lesson, that the world did not stop to mourn broken toys, and neither should he. But that was not the lesson Rowan learned. What Rowan learned, kneeling by that fireplace with a burned hand and a ruined horse and tears he refused to let his father see, was that things could be lost forever in an instant, through no fault of the thing itself, simply because someone more powerful decided it was time for it to be gone. And he learned, in that same moment, a kind of quiet, stubborn resolve that would define the rest of his life. He decided that he would never again let a broken thing be thrown away in front of him without at least trying to save it. He kept that blackened stub of wood. He still has it, in fact, on the highest shelf of that strange room in Crestfall Castle, the very first item in a collection that would eventually number in the hundreds. It is, by any reasonable measure, garbage. A useless piece of charcoal shaped vaguely like a horse. But Rowan does not see garbage when he looks at it. He sees the moment he decided who he was going to be. His brother Alaric died when Rowan was 19, a hunting accident, or so the official story went, though there were always whispers in the corridors of Crestfall that suggested the truth was messier and sadder than that, involving debts and a woman who was not who Alaric had told the family she was. Rowan never spoke about it, not even years later, not even to the servants who had known him his whole life and could read every mood behind his careful, composed face. All anyone knew was that Rowan went away for 6 months after his brother's funeral, and when he came back, he was already, unmistakably, the Duke of Crestfall in everything but the paperwork, because their father had aged 20 years in 6 months and could no longer manage the estate. The old Duke died 2 years later. Rowan inherited the title, the lands, the debts nobody had told him about, and a castle that had, over generations, accumulated a great deal of expensive, beautiful, entirely functional furniture and almost nothing that felt like a home. So he started collecting. Slowly, at first. A cracked vase from a market stall that the seller was about to smash because no one would buy it. A stray dog with 3 legs that the villagers wanted put down. A tenant farmer's daughter with a clubfoot who the local physician said would never walk properly, whom Rowan paid to have examined by 3 different specialists until one of them found a treatment that actually worked. He did not tell anyone why he did these things. He simply did them, quietly, consistently, the way some men drink too much or gamble too much. A compulsion dressed up as generosity, though it was underneath something rawer and lonelier than generosity. Every broken thing he mended was, in some small private way, an argument with his father's ghost. Proof that the man had been wrong. Proof that broken things were worth the trouble. By the time Rowan was 32 years old, the age he was on the night this story truly begins, he was one of the wealthiest and most reclusive nobles in the kingdom, famous in whispers for his strange habits and his stranger castle, unmarried despite the best efforts of every ambitious mother from the capital to the coast, and entirely, thoroughly convinced that he would live out the rest of his life exactly as he had lived the last 13 years of it. Mending objects, saving strays, and keeping his heart very, very carefully out of reach of anything that could break it the way his father had broken that little wooden horse. He did not know, that night, riding home late from a tedious meeting with a neighboring lord about a border dispute over a river that neither of them particularly cared about, that the storm building on the horizon was about to hand him the one broken thing his entire collection had been preparing him for. The storm came in off the sea faster than anyone predicted, the way storms in that part of the kingdom often did, rolling over the cliffs in a wall of black cloud that turned afternoon into midnight in the space of an hour. Rowan was already on horseback when it hit, his cloak doing very little against rain that came down sideways, his horse skittish and unhappy on a road that ran dangerously close to the cliff's edge in more than one stretch. He should have stopped at the inn in the village and waited it out. He knew that even as he pushed forward, some old habit of stubbornness, His father's stubbornness, if he was honest with himself, however much he hated to admit inheriting anything from that man, insisted that he could outrun the worst of it and be home before the road turned to mud. He was wrong. By the time he reached the cliff road proper, the rain had turned the packed earth into something closer to a river, and lightning was turning the whole coastline into a series of violent, flickering photographs. Cliff, sea, sky, cliff, sea, sky. Each flash showing him a little more of the disaster that had happened just ahead of him. Carriage. Overturned. Half off the road. One wheel still spinning uselessly in the wind. The horses that had pulled it were gone. Bolted, most likely, or cut loose by whoever had been driving. There was no driver in sight. No footman. No sign of the passengers who should have been screaming for help, if anyone had been left alive inside. Rowan dismounted before he had fully decided to. Some instinct older and more urgent than thought propelling him off his horse and down into the mud, toward the wreck. His first assumption, born of a long habit, was that he had come across an accident. A carriage that had simply lost control on the storm-slicked road, the way carriages sometimes did on that stretch, which was precisely why the local council had been arguing for years about whether to widen it. But when he got closer, when another flash of lightning lit the scene in stark white, he saw something that did not fit the story of an accident at all. The carriage door was not merely open. It had been thrown open, the latch broken from the outside rather than the inside. And a few feet from the wreck, half in a ditch that was rapidly filling with rainwater, lay a woman. She was not moving. He reached her in seconds that felt like hours, dropping to his knees in mud that soaked through his trousers instantly. His hands finding her face, her throat, searching frantically for a pulse while rain ran down his own face in sheets that made it nearly impossible to see. Her skin was cold, too cold, dangerously cold, and her dress, what remained of it, was torn in a way that told a story he did not like at all. A story that had nothing to do with a carriage accident and everything to do with a decision someone had made about her. He found a pulse. Faint, but there, fluttering under his fingers like something trying very hard not to give up. "Stay with me," he said, though she could not hear him, though he did not even know if she was capable of hearing anything at all. He said it anyway, the way people say things to the unconscious and the dying, not because the words will be received but because the alternative silence feels like giving up before you've even started trying. He could not carry her on horseback in this storm without risking both their lives on a cliff road that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable as a road at all. He made a decision in the space of a heartbeat, the same kind of decision he had been making his whole adult life about things far smaller and far less alive than this. He was not going to leave her. He half carried, half dragged her away from the ditch, up onto what remained of solid ground, and wrapped her in his own cloak, the wet wool doing little to warm her but doing something, at least, to shield her from the worst of the wind. Then he did the only thing he could think to do. He shouted into the storm for anyone, though he knew perfectly well that no one in their right mind would be out on the cliff road in weather like this, which meant the shouting was less a rescue plan and more a way of not feeling entirely powerless. It was luck, or perhaps something closer to fate, that a farmer named Old Bellamy happened to be out that night checking on a fence line near the road, worried about his sheep in the storm, and heard the Duke's voice carrying strangely on the wind. Bellamy had a cart. It was not much of a cart, but it was dry under its canvas cover, and between the two of them they managed to get the woman into it and covered against the worst of the rain. "She's not from around here," Bellamy said, squinting at her in the lantern light, water dripping off the brim of his hat. "Don't recognize the dress. Fine cloth, that, or was before it got torn up like that." Rowan did not answer. He was too busy pressing 2 fingers to her throat again, counting the seconds between each faint, fluttering pulse, willing them to stay steady. "Should take her to the village doctor," Bellamy offered. "No," Rowan said, and the word came out with more force than he expected, more certainty than he had any right to feel about a stranger he had known for less than 10 minutes. "Crestfall. Take us to Crestfall." Bellamy did not argue with a duke, even a strange one, even at midnight in a thunderstorm. He turned the cart toward the castle, and Rowan rode alongside it the entire way, one hand resting on the edge of the cart as if his touch alone could keep her from slipping any further away, watching her face in every flicker of lightning for some sign. Any sign that she was still fighting. She was, barely, but she was. By the time they reached the gates of Crestfall, Rowan had already made a decision that would upend everything about the careful, controlled, solitary life he had built for himself over the past 13 years. He did not know her name. He did not know where she came from, who had torn her dress, who had thrown open that carriage door and left her to die on a cliff road in a storm. He knew almost nothing about her at all. What he knew was this. She was broken, in every sense that word had ever meant to him, and he was not going to let her be thrown away. The physician at Crestfall, an elderly man named Master Hale who had served 3 generations of the Duke's family and had, by that point, seen enough strange things carried through the castle gates at odd hours that very little surprised him anymore, spent the better part of that first night working over the unconscious woman by candlelight, while Rowan paced the corridor outside her door like a man waiting to hear whether he had a future or not. The verdict, when it finally came near dawn, was cautiously hopeful. She had a fever from exposure, a badly bruised shoulder that had likely been wrenched when she was thrown from the carriage, and a series of cuts and scrapes consistent with being dragged, or thrown, across rough ground. What she did not have, thankfully, were broken bones, or the kind of internal injury that Master Hale had feared most on first examination. She was young, perhaps 24 or 25, though it was hard to say for certain with her face so pale and drawn, and she was, in the physician's professional opinion, strong enough to survive the night, provided the fever didn't worsen. And after the night? Rowan asked, because surviving one night was not the same as being whole. Master Hale gave him a long look, the kind of look a man who has known you since you were a boy in short trousers is allowed to give you. After the night, Your Grace, we will see what kind of woman she is. The body heals on its own schedule. I cannot promise you anything about the rest. Rowan understood the rest to mean more than the physical. He had seen the state of her dress before Master Hale's assistants had cut it away to treat her wounds, and he was not naive about what that state suggested. Whoever had put her in that carriage, whoever had thrown that door open on a cliff road in a storm and left her for dead in a ditch, had not done it out of simple carelessness. There was intention in it, cruelty in it, and cruelty like that did not simply vanish from a person's body once the fever broke. He did not sleep that first night or the second. He sat in a chair just outside her door, not inside, because propriety mattered even to a man who cared little for gossip, and because he understood on some instinctive level that a woman who had clearly been harmed by someone should not wake to find a strange man looming over her bed. And he waited, the way he had waited over broken things his entire life, patient and quiet and unwilling to give up on something before it had even had the chance to heal. On the 3rd day, her fever broke. On the 4th day, she woke up. Rowan was not in the room when it happened. He had finally, reluctantly, allowed himself to be persuaded into his own bed for a few hours of sleep, at the insistence of his housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Abernathy who had been managing the Crestfall household since before Rowan was born and was not remotely intimidated by his title. But he was told the moment he woke, and he was at the woman's door within minutes, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, his hair uncombed, looking far less like a duke and far more like a man who had spent 4 days terrified he was about to lose something he hadn't even known he wanted to keep. She was sitting up when he entered, propped against pillows, a maid named Greta hovering nearby with a cup of broth that the woman had not yet touched. She looked smaller in the daylight than she had looked in the storm, smaller and impossibly tired, with dark circles under eyes that were a shade of gray-blue that reminded Rowan, absurdly, of the sea just before a storm breaks. She looked at him with something that was not quite fear and not quite trust, but sat carefully, warily, in the space between the two. "You're the one who found me," she said. Her voice was hoarse from disuse and from the fever, but steady, steadier than Rowan expected. "I am," he said. "Rowan, Duke of Crestfall. This is my home. You're safe here." Something in her face shifted at the word safe. A flicker, quick and complicated, gone before Rowan could fully read it. "Safe," she repeated, as though testing the word to see if she believed it. "What is your name?" Rowan asked, gently, because he had spent 4 days not knowing it and it had started to feel like an unbearable gap, an emptiness where something essential should have been. She hesitated. It was a long hesitation, long enough that Rowan began to wonder if the fever had taken something from her. A memory, a name, the basic architecture of who she was, and he was already composing, in his head, patient reassurances about how these things sometimes returned slowly, when she finally spoke. "Isadora," she said. And then, after another pause, quieter, "I don't know if that name means anything to you yet, but it will. And when it does, I imagine you'll wish you'd left me in that ditch." It was such a strange thing to say, bitter and resigned and entirely unlike the gratitude Rowan might have expected from a woman he had just saved from freezing to death on a cliff road, that for a moment he simply stood there, unsure how to respond. But then he thought of the little wooden horse, blackened and ruined in his father's fireplace, and of every cracked vase and three-legged dog and broken violin he had refused to let the world throw away, and he found, without much effort at all, that he knew exactly what to say. "I don't care what your name means to anyone else," he told her. "I only care whether you intend to keep breathing. The rest, we can sort out once you're strong enough to argue with me about it." For the first time since he'd found her, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of Isadora's mouth. It did not last long, but it was there, and Rowan, a man who had spent 13 years learning to notice small signs of life in things everyone else had given up on, recognized it immediately for what it was. A crack of light in something that had very nearly gone dark for good. News travels strangely in castles. It moves through kitchens before it moves through drawing rooms, through stable hands before it moves through lords, and by the time it reaches the ears of the people who are supposed to be in charge, it has usually been reshaped 3 or 4 times over by servants who cannot help but add their own theories to the story. So it was, within a week of Isadora's arrival at Crestfall, that half the household had already decided among themselves that the mysterious woman the Duke had pulled from a wrecked carriage was either a runaway bride, a spy from a rival kingdom, or, this was Greta's favorite theory, whispered over laundry with the kind of relish only a good scandal can produce, a woman who had been thrown from her own family's carriage on purpose, disowned and discarded in the middle of a storm because of some unforgivable shame. Greta, as it turned out, was closer to the truth than any of them realized, though it would be some time before Isadora trusted anyone at Crestfall enough to confirm it. In those early weeks, Isadora said very little about her past. She answered Rowan's gentle questions with careful, deflecting half-truths. She was from the South, she said, from a family of minor nobility that had fallen on hard times, and the carriage accident had simply been an accident, nothing more, a wheel gone bad on a dangerous road. Rowan did not believe a word of it, but he also did not push. He had learned, over years of mending things far more fragile than a woman's pride, that forcing an answer before someone was ready to give it rarely produced the truth. It only produced a lie polished smooth enough to survive the pressure. So instead of questions, he gave her time and space. And, strange as it might have seemed to anyone who did not know him, he gave her the same thing he gave every broken object that came into his care: patience without expectation. She was given her own rooms in the East Wing, sunny and warm, with a view over the gardens rather than the cliffs, because Mrs. Abernathy, without needing to be told, in the way that good housekeepers simply understand things, decided that a woman recovering from whatever had put her in that ditch did not need a daily reminder of storms and drops and broken things. She was given new dresses, simple but well-made, sewn by the castle's seamstress from fabric that did not scream of nobility or poverty, because nobody, including Isadora herself, seemed entirely sure yet which one she was supposed to be. And she was given, most importantly, the freedom to move about the castle as she pleased, once she was strong enough to walk unassisted, which was more freedom than most guests, let alone strangers pulled half-dead from a ditch, would ordinarily be granted in a duke's household. Rowan gave orders quietly to every member of his staff. She was not to be questioned, not to be watched, not to be treated as anything other than an honored guest, for as long as she wished to remain. It was on one of these free, unsupervised wanderings, about 3 weeks into her stay, that Isadora found the room. She had not meant to intrude. She had simply been exploring the unfamiliar corridors of a castle far larger than any home she had ever lived in, drawn by curiosity and the restless energy of a body finally strong enough to move but a mind still too troubled to sit still, when she came upon a door that stood slightly ajar at the end of a quiet hallway in the West Wing. She should have walked past it. Instead, she pushed it open. What she found inside stopped her cold. Shelves, floor to ceiling, on every wall. And on those shelves, hundreds of objects, none of them whole. A teacup missing its handle. A vase held together with careful, visible seams of dried resin. A music box she recognized, somehow without being told, as broken. She could tell by the particular stillness of it, the way an object that no longer works has a different kind of silence than an object that was never meant to make sound at all. A sword. A birdcage. Dolls with missing eyes, carefully restitched. Paintings torn and mended. An entire wall of clocks, none of them ticking. All of them stopped at different hours, as if time itself had shattered into hundreds of separate, disagreeing pieces. She was still standing in the doorway, transfixed, when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Rowan watching her from the hall, his expression unreadable in the way it so often was. "I'm sorry," Isadora said quickly, stepping back. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Rowan said, and he did not sound angry, which surprised her, because something about the careful reverence of the room had suggested to her that this was a private place, a place not meant for wandering guests to stumble into. "Not many people find this room by accident. I've often thought that says something about them when they do." "What does it say?" Isadora asked, still looking past him at the shelves, at the broken, mended things arranged with a care that bordered on devotion. "That they notice things other people walk past," Rowan said. "That they're drawn to what's incomplete instead of repelled by it." Isadora stepped further into the room, her fingers hovering just above a small ceramic bird, whose wing had been cracked and carefully rejoined, the fracture line visible but no longer weak. "You fixed all of these?" "Most of them. Some I'm still working on. Some I haven't figured out how to mend yet, so they wait." He paused, watching her with an intensity that made her feel, not for the first time since arriving at Crestfall, thoroughly seen in a way she was not entirely comfortable with. "I don't throw broken things away, Isadora. I never have. I'd rather spend years trying to mend something than a single afternoon deciding it isn't worth the trouble." She was quiet for a long moment, turning the ceramic bird slightly on its shelf, tracing the fracture line with one careful finger. "And what happens?" she asked, without looking at him. "To the things that can't be mended, the things that are too broken." Rowan considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "I don't believe there's such a thing," he said finally. "I believe there are things that take longer than others. Things that need a different kind of care than I know how to give yet. But I've never found something so broken that mending it was impossible. Only things I hadn't yet figured out how to fix." Isadora looked up at him then, and there was something in her expression, raw, unguarded, the closest thing to honest he had seen from her since the night he pulled her from the ditch, that told him, without a single word, that she was not really asking about teacups and music boxes anymore. She was asking about herself. And Rowan, watching her carefully, understood that too, and answered her exactly the way he meant to. "Everything can be mended, Isadora," he said quietly. "Even when it doesn't feel that way." She did not answer him, but she did not leave the room either, not for a long while, and when she finally did, she carried the small ceramic bird with her. Rowan's gift, offered without a word, simply pressed into her hand as she turned to go, and kept it on the table beside her bed for the rest of her time at Crestfall. A small, cracked, carefully mended thing that had somehow, without either of them quite meaning it to happen, become the first small thread connecting two people who had both spent far too long, convinced they were beyond repair. In the weeks that followed, the room became something of a sanctuary for both of them, though neither would have used that word out loud, not yet. Isadora began visiting in the afternoons, when the light through the tall windows fell soft and golden across the shelves, and more often than not she would find Rowan already there, working over some new acquisition with the careful, patient concentration of a man performing surgery rather than mending a broken clasp or a chipped bit of porcelain. She learned, in those afternoons, that the stories behind the objects mattered to him as much as the objects themselves. He could tell her exactly where each piece had come from. The vase that a grieving widow had smashed against a wall and immediately regretted, the violin that had belonged to a street musician who could no longer afford to have it properly repaired, the sword that had been thrown into a lake by a soldier who wanted nothing more to do with the war it represented, until Rowan had it dredged up years later and restored not to be wielded again, but simply to be remembered. "Why does it matter to you?" Isadora asked one afternoon, watching him carefully rewind the delicate spring inside a pocket watch that had stopped keeping time sometime around the reign of the previous king. Whose it was, I mean. Why not just fix the mechanism and be done with it? Rowan didn't look up from his work, but he answered readily enough, the way he had come to answer most of her questions in those weeks, without hesitation, without the careful deflection he used with almost everyone else. Because the mechanism isn't really what's broken, he said. Not in any way that matters. A watch that doesn't tell time is just a watch that doesn't tell time. A simple problem easily fixed by anyone with steady hands and a bit of training. What actually matters is the person who owned it, and why it stopped mattering enough to them to have it fixed sooner. That's the real break. The mechanism is just where it shows. Isadora was quiet for a long moment. That's a very complicated way of looking at broken clocks. Perhaps, Rowan allowed. But I found it's usually true of broken things generally. The visible damage is rarely the whole story. She did not answer that. She had grown very good, in her weeks at Crestfall, at recognizing when a conversation was circling close to something she was not yet ready to say out loud. And she had grown equally good at redirecting it, gently, without seeming to. But something about the quiet, unhurried patience of that room, and of the man who kept it, made the redirection harder each time. It was as though the room itself was daring her toward honesty, one careful, mended object at a time. It was in that room, nearly 2 months after her arrival, that Isadora finally began to tell Rowan the truth. It happened almost by accident, the way important truths so often do. She had picked up a small painting from one of the lower shelves, a portrait of a young woman, torn once straight through the middle and stitched back together with thread so fine it was barely visible except under close inspection, and asked, out of simple curiosity, who the woman in the painting had been. I don't know, Rowan admitted. I found the painting in a burned-out house years ago, after a fire that had gutted most of the building. There was no family left to ask. I mended it because it seemed wrong to let her disappear entirely, even if I never learned her name. Isadora looked at the painting for a long moment, at the torn line running straight through the young woman's chest, mended but still visible, a scar that would never fully vanish no matter how carefully it had been repaired, and something in her seemed to give way quietly, like a dam that had held far longer than it was built to. My father sold me, she said. The words came out flat, almost matter-of-fact, as though she had rehearsed them so many times in her own head that they had lost the power to hurt her by the time they finally reached the air. Rowan set down the pocket watch he had been holding and gave her his full, undivided attention. The same attention he gave to every fracture line, every broken hinge, every small tragedy that came through his door. Not in so many words, Isadora continued, her eyes still fixed on the mended painting. There was a contract. A very proper, very legal marriage contract to a man twice my age, a man my father owed a great deal of money to. I was 17 when the arrangement was made. I didn't meet my future husband until I was 22, on the day of the wedding itself, because my father was afraid that if I saw the man beforehand, I would find some way to refuse. Did you refuse? Rowan asked quietly. I tried, Isadora said, and something bitter crept into her voice for the first time. It didn't matter. The contract was binding. My father had already spent the money. There was no undoing it, not without ruining both families, and my father made it very clear that ruining our family was not an option he was prepared to consider, whatever the cost to me personally. She fell silent for a long moment, turning the small painting over in her hands, and Rowan did not push her to continue, understanding instinctively that the rest of the story would come when it was ready, not before. My husband, Isadora said finally, was not a kind man. I don't think I need to explain that any further than I already have. I stayed as long as I could bear it, because I had nowhere else to go and no family who would take me back. And then, 3 months ago, I finally understood that staying was going to kill me. Not quickly, not in any way anyone could point to and call a crime, but slowly, the way a person dies when every part of themselves that matters has already been taken away. So I left. I took what little I could carry and I ran, and I made it almost 200 miles before his men caught up with me. Rowan's jaw tightened, though he said nothing, waiting. They didn't bring me back to him, Isadora said. That would have been an admission, you understand. Proof that his wife had run from him, Proof that something in his household wasn't as it should be. That wasn't acceptable. So instead, they put me in a carriage on a cliff road in a storm, and they threw the door open, and they let the road decide what happened next. If I died, it would have been an accident. A tragic accident on a dangerous stretch of road. And no one would have asked any further questions. Because who questions an accident? The room was very quiet after that. Outside, somewhere in the gardens, a bird was singing, oblivious to the weight of what had just been said inside those walls. "I'm not a runaway bride with a broken engagement," Isadora said finally, looking up at Rowan for the first time since she'd begun speaking, her eyes hard and steady despite everything. "I'm a married woman who ran from her husband and was very nearly murdered for it. If he learns I'm alive, if he learns I'm here, he will come for me, Rowan, and he will not throw open a carriage door and hope for the best a second time. He'll finish the job properly." Rowan was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Isadora had ever heard it, but no less certain for the quiet. "Then he'll have to come through me first," he said. "And I promise you, Isadora, nothing in this castle has ever been taken from me without a fight. Not once in 13 years. I don't intend to start now with you." It was not a declaration of love. Not yet. But it was, Isadora understood, something almost as significant. A promise offered freely, from a man who had spent his entire life keeping exactly the kind of promises other people considered too much trouble to bother with. A secret of that size does not stay perfectly contained, not even in a household as loyal as Crestfall's. Rowan told no one but Mrs. Abernathy and Master Hale, both of whom had served the family long enough to be trusted with far heavier truths than this one, and both of whom agreed, without a moment's hesitation, that Isadora's presence at Crestfall would simply never be discussed outside the castle walls. But servants talked to other servants, and other servants talked to merchants in the village, and merchants talked to travelers passing through, and somewhere in that long, slow chain of whispers, a piece of information can travel a surprising distance before anyone realizes it has left the house at all. It took nearly 4 months for the whisper to reach the wrong ears. In that time, though, something had shifted between Rowan and Isadora that neither of them had fully named yet, but that everyone else in the household could see plainly enough. She no longer flinched when he entered a room. She had begun joining him for dinner most evenings, in the smaller dining room rather than the vast, cold formal hall that Rowan rarely used for anything but obligatory entertaining. She had taken to reading in the library while he worked through the estate's endless correspondence, the two of them sharing a comfortable, easy silence that neither felt any particular need to fill with conversation. And she had started, slowly, cautiously, to laugh again. Mrs. Abernathy remarked on it more than once to the kitchen staff. How strange and wonderful it was to hear laughter echoing down the corridors of a castle that had, for 13 years, been about as cheerful as a tomb. The first time it happened, apparently, was over something entirely mundane. Rowan attempting, with great seriousness and absolutely no skill whatsoever, to teach Isadora how to properly hold a fishing rod during an afternoon at the small lake on the estate grounds, and managing, in the process, to fall in himself. Isadora's laughter, Greta reported breathlessly to the rest of the staff, had been the kind that made the birds startle out of the nearby trees. Isadora, for her part, noticed changes in Rowan too, subtle as they were. He smiled more, though his smiles remained rare and, when they came, oddly precious for their rarity, like sunlight breaking briefly through heavy clouds. He had begun, without ever quite announcing it, to seek her opinion on the objects in his collection, asking what she thought a particular broken thing needed, whether it was ready to be mended or whether it needed more time first, as though her instincts on the matter had become, to him, as valuable as his own. It was Isadora who first suggested, one quiet evening in the room of mended things, that perhaps not every broken object needed to be fixed to look exactly as it had before. "This bowl," she said, turning over a shattered piece of blue-glazed pottery that Rowan had been puzzling over for weeks, unable to find enough of the missing fragments to restore it properly. "You keep trying to make it whole the way it was. But what if you didn't? What if you filled the gaps with gold instead of trying to hide them?" "Gold?" Rowan repeated, turning the idea over as carefully as he turned over the bowl itself. "I read about it once," Isadora said. "A practice from the Far East. When something breaks, instead of pretending the break never happened, you fill the cracks with gold lacquer, and the mended piece becomes more valuable than it was before it broke. Not despite the damage, but because of it. Because the breaking becomes part of the object's story instead of something to hide. Rowan looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. You don't think brokenness is something to be ashamed of, then? I think, Isadora said slowly, choosing her words with obvious care, that I've spent a very long time believing it was. Believing that what happened to me made me less than I was before, damaged goods in the truest sense of that horrible phrase. But sitting in this room, watching you treat every cracked, broken, forgotten thing like it still has value, I've started to wonder if I had it backward. If the cracks aren't the end of the story. If they're just proof that something survived. Rowan did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the shattered bowl, set it carefully back on its shelf, and turned to look at her directly, with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly in her throat. I don't think you're broken, Isadora, he said quietly. I think you're mending. There's a difference, and I think it's an important one. It was around this time, this fragile, tender, still unspoken time, that the whisper about Isadora's true identity finally reached the ears of a traveling merchant who happened to have done business, on more than one occasion, with the household of a certain lord in the south whose wife had mysteriously vanished some months prior, presumed dead in a tragic carriage accident on the northern cliff roads. The merchant, sensing an opportunity for profit rather than any particular concern for Isadora's well-being, made careful, quiet inquiries. And within a fortnight, word reached the south. Word reached a man who had spent 4 months believing his problem had solved itself, and who was considerably less pleased than one might expect to learn that it had not. His name was Lord Edmund Ashgrove, and he was already making plans to travel north before the month was out. Before the story moves forward, before Lord Edmund Ashgrove arrives at the gates of Crestfall and forces a confrontation that neither Rowan nor Isadora is fully prepared for, it is worth pausing to understand something about Rowan himself that even Isadora did not yet know. Because for all his patience, for all his quiet certainty about mending broken things, Rowan carried his own fracture, one he had never shown to anyone, one buried so deep beneath 13 years of careful control that even Mrs. Abernathy, who knew him better than almost anyone alive, believed it had healed over long ago. It had not. Rowan had been engaged once before, in his mid-20s, to a young woman named Cecilia, the daughter of a minor baron whose lands bordered Crestfall's own. It had not been a great romance, not in the beginning. More a practical arrangement between two families who liked each other well enough and saw obvious benefit in the match. But over the 18 months of their engagement, something real had grown between them. Rowan, who had spent his whole life feeling like an oddity even within his own family, had found in Cecilia someone who did not think his habits strange at all. She had loved the room of mended things as much as he did. She had, in fact, been the one who suggested he open a small workshop in the village, so that ordinary people with broken belongings could bring them to him rather than simply throwing them away. An idea he had never quite found the courage to act on after she was gone, though he still thought about it more often than he would ever admit. 3 weeks before their wedding, Cecilia fell ill with a fever that no physician, not even the considerable skill of Master Hale, could break. She died in the span of 11 days, and Rowan, who had spent his entire life believing that with enough patience and enough care, anything broken could eventually be mended, learned the one lesson his collecting had never quite prepared him for. That some things cannot be saved, no matter how desperately you want to save them, no matter how much of yourself you're willing to give in the attempt. He had not opened himself to anyone in the 7 years since. Not fully. He had continued collecting teacups and violins and 3-legged dogs and clubfoot farmers' daughters, because that, at least, was a kind of mending he could still control, could still guarantee some measure of success in. But people, real people, whole people whose hearts might one day be entrusted to him again, he had avoided with the same careful, deliberate consistency he applied to everything else in his life. Until Isadora. He recognized, somewhere in that 4th month of her recovery, that what he felt for her had grown into something far larger and far more dangerous than the simple compulsion to mend a broken stranger he'd pulled from a ditch. He recognized it in the way his chest tightened pleasantly whenever she laughed, in the way he found himself inventing small excuses to seek her out during the day, when patience should have told him to leave her to her own recovery, her own pace, in the quiet, persistent hope, Foolish, he told himself, dangerous, he told himself, and yet unshakable regardless, that she might, someday, come to feel something similar for him. It terrified him, in a way that no broken teacup or shattered vase ever had, because objects, however precious, could not choose to leave. Isadora could. And more than that, Isadora could be taken from him, the way Cecilia had been taken, by forces entirely outside his control, and Rowan was not at all certain he possessed the strength to survive that particular grief a second time. He told none of this to Isadora directly, but she began to notice, in the weeks following her confession about her marriage, that Rowan had grown quieter around her in a different way than before. Not distant, exactly, but careful, guarded, as though he were holding something back that required considerable effort to contain. She did not push him to explain it. She understood, by then, the particular etiquette of two wounded people slowly circling closer to trust, and she extended to him the same patience he had extended to her. It was Mrs. Abernathy, in the end, who finally told Isadora about Cecilia, not out of gossip, but out of a genuine, motherly concern that Isadora understand what she was walking into before she walked any further. "He hasn't let himself care for anyone since," Mrs. Abernathy said one afternoon, over tea in the small parlor she and Isadora had taken to sharing most days, a habit that had grown into something like genuine friendship over the months. "Not truly. Not the way he cares for you, my dear, whether he's said the words yet or not. I've watched that boy grow up. I watched him bury his brother, and his father, and his intended, all within a handful of years, and each time, he learned a little better how to shut a piece of himself away where nothing could reach it to hurt him again. I never thought I'd see him let anyone near that part of himself. Until you." Isadora sat with that information for a long time after Mrs. Abernathy left, turning it over the way she had once turned over the small ceramic bird, examining every fracture line, understanding suddenly and completely why Rowan's collection of broken things meant so much more to him than simple charity. He was not mending objects out of idle sentiment. He was mending them because it was the only kind of mending he trusted himself to do without risking his heart in the process. And now, without quite meaning to, without quite being ready for it, he had started risking his heart anyway on her. That evening, she found him in the room of mended things, as she so often did, working late by lamplight on the delicate hinge of an old jewelry box. She did not say anything about what Mrs. Abernathy had told her. She simply sat down beside him, closer than she usually did, and picked up a small cloth to help polish the box's tarnished surface while he worked. "You don't have to tell me," she said quietly, after a long, comfortable silence, "about whatever it is you're carrying that makes you so careful with me. I know there's something. I felt it, in the way you look at me sometimes, like you're afraid I might disappear if you blink." Rowan's hands stilled over the jewelry box. He did not look up immediately. "I lost someone," he said finally. "A long time ago. Someone I loved, who I couldn't save, no matter how much I wanted to. And I think some part of me has been afraid, ever since, of caring about anyone enough that losing them would break something in me that I couldn't mend." Isadora set down her cloth and reached for his hand. The scarred one, the one with the faint pale line along the palm from a fire he had not yet told her about, though he would, eventually, tell her everything. "I understand that fear," she said softly, "better than almost anyone could. I spent years believing that caring about anything, or anyone, only made the eventual loss more unbearable. That's why I told myself, for so long, that leaving my husband wasn't really about escaping cruelty. It was about protecting myself from ever caring enough about anything again to be hurt by losing it." "And now?" Rowan asked, finally looking up to meet her eyes. "Now," Isadora said, her fingers tightening gently around his. "I think I'd rather risk being broken again than spend the rest of my life pretending I don't want to be whole. And I think, Rowan, that you might feel the same way, whether you've let yourself admit it or not." Neither of them said the word love that night, but something passed between them, quiet and certain, that made the word feel closer than it had ever felt before, closer and less frightening, and, for the first time in a very long while, worth the risk. Lord Edmund Ashgrove arrived at the gates of Crestfall on a grey morning in early autumn, with an entourage of 6 armed men and a legal document he was quite certain no duke in the kingdom, however wealthy or well-connected, would dare to ignore. Rowan received him in the great hall, formally, coldly, with Mrs. Abernathy stationed just outside the door and word already sent quietly to have Isadora kept far from the room, in a locked wing of the castle where none of Ashgrove's men could reach her without going through half the household guard first. Rowan had not seen the man before, and his first impression, watching Ashgrove stride into the hall with the easy arrogance of someone entirely unaccustomed to being told no, did nothing to improve on the picture Isadora's account had already painted. "Your Grace," Ashgrove said, with a shallow, perfunctory bow that suggested he considered the gesture beneath him even as he performed it. "I understand you've been harboring my wife." "I've been harboring a guest," Rowan said evenly, "who arrived at my door half dead after being thrown from a moving carriage during a storm. I was not aware, at the time, that I was required to check a woman's marriage papers before deciding whether or not to save her life." Something flickered across Ashgrove's face. Irritation, quickly smoothed away. "A regrettable accident. My men have been searching for her for months, terrified something exactly like this had happened. I'm relieved beyond words to learn she survived it." "Are you?" Rowan said, in a tone that made the two words sound less like a question and more like an accusation. The two men regarded each other for a long, tense moment, and Rowan understood, in that silence, that Ashgrove knew perfectly well he was not fooling anyone, and did not particularly care. Men like Ashgrove rarely bothered pretending for the sake of honesty. They pretended because pretending was the socially acceptable script, and scripts, followed correctly, tended to get a man what he wanted without the inconvenience of an honest fight. "I've come to bring my wife home," Ashgrove said, producing the document he'd been carrying and setting it on the table between them with the deliberate confidence of a man laying down a winning hand of cards. "This is our marriage contract, Your Grace, legally binding under the laws of this kingdom. Whatever misunderstanding brought her into your care, I'm sure you'll agree that a wife belongs with her husband, not sheltered indefinitely in the home of an unmarried duke. I'm sure you can appreciate how unseemly that arrangement might appear to anyone inclined to gossip." It was a threat dressed up as concern for propriety, and Rowan recognized it instantly for exactly what it was. He did not so much as glance at the document. "I've read enough marriage contracts in my time to know precisely what they can and cannot compel," Rowan said. "A contract obligates a woman to marry a man. It does not obligate her to remain in his household after he has, by his own men's account, attempted to have her killed on a cliff road. I'd advise you, Lord Ashgrove, to consult a rather better solicitor before you attempt to use that document as leverage in my home." Ashgrove's carefully composed mask slipped, just slightly, at the word "killed," and for a moment Rowan saw the man underneath the practiced civility. Something colder, meaner, more dangerous than the polished lord standing in his hall. "That is a very serious accusation, Your Grace, from a man who wasn't present to witness whatever actually happened that night." "I was present enough to pull her out of a ditch," Rowan said. "I was present enough to watch a physician spend 3 days uncertain whether she'd survive her injuries. I don't need to have witnessed the moment the carriage door was thrown open to understand what happened to her, and I would strongly caution you against continuing to insult my intelligence by suggesting otherwise." The silence that followed was heavy enough that even Ashgrove's men, standing at attention near the hall's entrance, seemed to shift uncomfortably. "She is my wife," Ashgrove said finally, his voice lower now, harder, stripped of its earlier pretense of civility. "Whatever you believe happened, whatever story she's told you to win your sympathy, and I imagine, Your Grace, given your reputation, that sympathy is not difficult to win from you, the law is on my side. If she does not return with me willingly, I am well within my rights to petition the Crown to compel her return, and to bring considerable legal difficulty upon anyone found to be unlawfully harboring a runaway wife." "Then petition the Crown," Rowan said, without hesitation, without so much as a flicker of the fear Ashgrove had clearly hoped his threat would produce. "I have considerable resources of my own, Lord Ashgrove, and considerable patience for legal battles fought on behalf of people I care about. I would advise you to consider very carefully whether you have the stomach for a fight that will drag your household's private business into every courtroom and drawing room in the capital. Because I promise you, I have nothing to hide in this matter, and I suspect you have a great deal." It was, Rowan knew even as he said it, a considerable gamble, a threat matched against a threat, with no guarantee that either man's bluff would hold. But he had spent 13 years learning exactly how far he was willing to go to protect something he refused to let be thrown away, and he was not about to discover, now, that the answer had limits when it came to Isadora. Ashgrove studied him for a long moment, some calculation working visibly behind his eyes, before he finally retrieved the marriage contract from the table and folded it away with considerably less confidence than he had displayed setting it down. "This isn't finished, Your Grace," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I will have my wife back, one way or another." "You are welcome to try," Rowan said, holding the man's gaze without blinking. "But you should know that every attempt you make, I will meet, for as long as it takes, with everything I have. I don't give up on things easily, Lord Ashgrove. Ask anyone who knows me." Ashgrove left Crestfall within the hour, his entourage trailing behind him, and Rowan stood at the window of the great hall long after the last of them had disappeared down the winding cliff road, watching, waiting, feeling the cold certainty settle over him that the confrontation had not ended, only paused, and that whatever came next would test every promise he had made to Isadora far more severely than anything that had come before. Isadora found Rowan still standing at that window nearly an hour after Ashgrove's departure, and she did not need to ask what had happened to understand, from the set of his shoulders and the tension in his jaw, that the confrontation had gone exactly as badly as she had feared it would. "He's not going to stop," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "No," Rowan agreed. "I don't imagine he is. Men like that rarely accept the first refusal as final. They simply regroup and come at the problem from a different angle." Isadora was quiet for a long moment, watching the empty road below, before she spoke again, her voice carrying a weight and a determination Rowan had not heard from her before. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, "about that night, about what really happened before the carriage." Rowan turned to look at her fully, giving her his complete attention the way he always did, and waited. "Edmund didn't simply decide on a whim to have me killed because I ran," Isadora said. "There's more to it than that. When I married him, part of the arrangement, part of what my father owed him, involved property. Land that had belonged to my mother's family, that was supposed to pass to me directly, separate from anything my father controlled. Edmund wanted it folded into our marriage contract permanently so that it would belong to him regardless of what happened between us. My father agreed because my father agreed to nearly everything Edmund asked, but there was one condition neither of them could get around. Under the old inheritance laws in the South, that land can only transfer permanently to a husband if the marriage lasts a full 5 years. Before that, if the marriage ends through death, divorce, or annulment, the land reverts entirely to me or to my direct heirs. "How long were you married before you ran?" Rowan asked, understanding already where this was going. 4 years and 9 months, Isadora said. 3 months short. If I had simply disappeared, divorced him, or been granted an annulment through some legal channel, the land would have reverted to me, and Edmund would have lost the single largest asset he stood to gain from our marriage. But if I died, married, before the 5 years were up, the land passes to him as your husband, regardless of the original condition. Rowan finished, the full shape of the scheme settling into place with sickening clarity. He didn't try to have you killed because you ran from him, Isadora. He tried to have you killed because your running threatened to cost him a fortune he'd already spent years planning to secure. Your survival is the only thing standing between him and land he considers, by now, as good as his. Which means, Isadora said grimly, that even if he loses this fight over the marriage contract, even if the crown rules that I'm free to remain here, he's not going to simply walk away. Not while I'm alive to inherit that land eventually. He needs me dead before those 5 years are up, Rowan, one way or another, and that deadline is now less than 3 months away. Rowan absorbed this in silence, his mind already working through the problem with the same methodical patience he brought to every broken mechanism that crossed his workshop table, searching for the fracture point, the weakness, the piece that, properly understood, might allow the whole tangled situation to be mended rather than simply survived. 3 months, he said slowly. If we can keep you safe and keep the marriage legally unresolved, for 3 months, the land reverts to you regardless of what happens to the marriage itself. His entire motive disappears. There would be no further reason for him to risk everything trying to have you killed, because the thing he wants would already be permanently out of reach. Assuming he doesn't simply try harder out of pure spite, once he realizes he's about to lose, Isadora said. Assuming that, Rowan agreed. But spite is a weaker motive than greed, Isadora, in my experience. Men like Ashgrove take considerable risks for profit. Fewer of them take the same risks purely to satisfy their pride, especially once the practical prize is already lost. If we can survive these 3 months, I believe the worst of this danger passes with them. Surviving 3 months against a man with money, connections, and apparently very few scruples about using violence, Isadora said, is not a small thing to ask, Rowan. No, Rowan agreed, reaching for her hand, the same gesture she had offered him in the room of mended things not long before. It isn't. But I told you once that if he came for you, he'd have to come through me first. I meant it then, and I mean it considerably more now that I understand exactly what we're up against. We'll survive these 3 months, Isadora. Together. I promise you that. It was, perhaps, an easy promise to make in the quiet safety of a castle window, with the danger currently many miles away on a road leading south. It would prove considerably harder to keep. The weeks following Ashgrove's visit brought a new tension to Crestfall, one that neither Rowan nor Isadora could fully shake despite their best efforts. Rowan doubled the castle guard without announcement, quietly stationing men along the cliff road and the main approaches to the estate, watching for any sign that Ashgrove intended to make good on his implicit threat sooner rather than later. Isadora, for her part, found herself flinching again at unfamiliar sounds, a habit she had worked hard to unlearn in her months of recovery, and one that returned now with frustrating persistence, a reminder that healing was rarely a straight line from broken to whole. But amid that tension, something else was also growing, steady and undeniable, refusing to be dimmed by the shadow hanging over them. Rowan found himself, more and more, unable to imagine the castle or his life without Isadora in it. It was not simply that he cared for her well-being, the way he cared for every broken thing he had ever taken in. It had become something larger than that, something that made his chest ache pleasantly whenever she entered a room, something that made the prospect of losing her considerably more terrifying than the prospect of losing anything else he had ever collected. He told her so, finally, on a cool evening about 6 weeks after Ashgrove's visit, in the room of mended things, surrounded by every broken, careful, precious object he had spent 13 years refusing to let the world discard. I need to tell you something, he said, setting aside the delicate clockwork mechanism he had been working on. And I need you to understand that I'm not saying it because of the danger we're facing, or because I think it will make you feel safer. I'm saying it because I've been trying, for weeks now, to find a way to keep it to myself, and I've discovered I'm simply no longer capable of doing that convincingly. Isadora set down the book she had been reading, giving him her full attention, something careful and hopeful moving behind her eyes. I love you, Rowan said, simply, without embellishment, the way he said most important things. I think I've loved you since the 3rd week you were here, when you laughed for the first time and I realized I would have burned this entire castle to the ground just to hear it again. I didn't want to tell you while Ashgrove's threat still hangs over us, because I didn't want you to feel obligated to say anything back out of gratitude, or fear, or the simple loneliness of your situation. But I find I can't keep pretending this is only about mending a broken stranger anymore. Isadora. It stopped being that a long time ago. Isadora was quiet for a long moment, and Rowan, watching her, felt a familiar flicker of the old fear. The fear that had kept him from opening his heart to anyone in the 7 years since Cecilia's death. The fear that speaking a truth this large out loud was the surest way to guarantee its eventual, devastating loss. But when Isadora finally spoke, her voice was steady and warm and entirely without hesitation. I love you too, she said. I think I've known it for longer than I've let myself admit, because loving you felt like something I hadn't earned the right to want anymore, after everything Edmund took from me. But sitting in this room, watching you mend things nobody else thought were worth saving, watching you treat me the same way, like I was worth the trouble, worth the patience, worth waiting for, I stopped believing that love was something I'd lost the right to. You gave that back to me, Rowan, long before you said any of this out loud. Rowan crossed the small distance between them and took her face gently in his hands, the scarred palm resting against her cheek with a tenderness that made Isadora's breath catch. "I don't know exactly how this ends," he admitted quietly. "I don't know if we survive the next 3 months without Ashgrove finding some way through every precaution I've put in place. But I know that whatever happens, I don't want to face it without telling you the truth first. I love you, Isadora. Whole, broken, mended, unmended. All of it. I love every part of you, including the parts you're still afraid to show me." When Isadora kissed him, it was the first time either of them had allowed themselves that particular kind of hope since the night a storm had thrown 2 broken lives together on a cliff road. Hope not just for survival, but for something considerably larger and more precious than survival. Hope for a future neither of them had quite dared to imagine until now. It would be tested sooner and more violently than either of them expected, within the very same week. The attack came, as these things so often do, when they were least prepared for it. Not on the cliff road, where Rowan had concentrated his defenses, but from within the castle itself, through a servant Ashgrove's men had managed to bribe weeks earlier. A young stable hand named Wick, who had been struggling to pay off a gambling debt and had, in a moment of desperate weakness, agreed to leave a side gate unlocked on a night of his choosing, in exchange for enough coin to clear his debt. Entirely. It happened just past midnight, 10 weeks into the standoff, with barely 3 weeks remaining before the 5-year deadline that would have rendered the entire scheme pointless. Ashgrove, it seemed, had grown impatient, or perhaps simply desperate, watching his window of opportunity narrow with each passing day, and had decided that a direct, decisive strike was worth the risk that a slower, more careful approach no longer seemed to justify. Isadora woke to the sound of her bedroom door being forced, and had only enough time to grab the small ceramic bird from her bedside table. Rowan's first gift to her, clutched now like a talisman rather than a weapon, though it would serve as neither, before 2 of Ashgrove's men were in the room, moving toward her with the brutal efficiency of men who had been paid to finish a job quickly and without complication. Her scream carried further than the intruders expected, echoing down the stone corridors of a castle built, centuries ago, with exactly this kind of acoustics in mind. A castle designed by ancestors who understood that stone carries warning as effectively as it carries silence. Rowan was out of his own bed and moving before he was fully awake, some instinct deeper than conscious thought propelling him toward the sound, and he reached Isadora's room within moments, his sword, an old blade, plain and unadorned, nothing like the gleaming ceremonial weapons displayed in the castle's formal halls, already in hand. What followed was brief, violent, and entirely unlike anything the quiet, careful Duke of Crestfall's household had ever witnessed from him. Rowan fought with a controlled, desperate fury that surprised even the castle guards who arrived moments later to find one intruder already disarmed and bleeding on the floor, the second retreating rapidly through the window he'd entered by, abandoning the mission entirely rather than face the man standing between him and his target. It was over in less than 2 minutes. But 2 minutes, Isadora would reflect later, had been more than enough to remind her, viscerally and completely, of exactly what she had almost lost a second time, and exactly what Rowan had been willing to risk, without a moment's hesitation, to prevent it. "Are you hurt?" Rowan demanded, crossing the room to her the instant the second intruder had fled. His hands moving over her shoulders, her face, checking for injury with the same frantic thoroughness he'd shown that first night on the cliff road. "I'm all right," Isadora said, though her voice was shaking, and the ceramic bird was still clutched so tightly in her hand that its edges had left small red marks against her palm. "I'm all right, Rowan. You got here in time." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her the way a man holds something he has come dangerously, unbearably close to losing, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply breathing together in the aftermath of violence that had nearly rewritten the ending of their story before it had properly begun. The captured intruder, once questioned, firmly, but without the cruelty Ashgrove himself had shown no hesitation employing, confirmed everything Rowan and Isadora had already suspected. Ashgrove had sent them. Ashgrove had paid Wick to leave the gate unlocked. And Ashgrove, growing desperate as his deadline approached, had made it explicitly clear to his men that this attempt was not meant to look like an accident this time. He wanted the matter finished, cleanly and completely, regardless of what questions it might raise afterward. That last piece of information changed everything. An accident on a cliff road was one thing, Deniable, dismissible, easily explained away to anyone who came asking. A deliberate assassination attempt inside the home of a duke, however, was an entirely different matter, one that no amount of money or influence could easily smooth over once it became known. And it was about to become very known indeed, because Rowan had no intention whatsoever of letting this attack go unanswered. "He's made a mistake," Rowan said grimly. Once the captured intruder had been secured and Isadora had finally stopped shaking in his arms. Whatever legal cover he thought he had, whatever plausible deniability he believed his money could still buy him, he's just handed it away, trying to force the issue before his deadline runs out. "This isn't a private family matter anymore, Isadora. This is attempted murder, committed on my land, against a guest under my protection. I intend to make certain the Crown understands exactly what that means for him." In the days that followed the attack, Rowan moved with the same quiet, methodical determination he had once brought to mending a shattered pocket watch or a torn painting, except now the thing he was determined to mend was Isadora's safety, permanently and completely, in a way that left Ashgrove no further room to maneuver. He rode to the capital himself, 3 days hard travel, carrying with him the captured intruder as evidence, along with a formal petition to the Crown detailing everything. The original attempt on Isadora's life on the cliff road, the scheme involving her mother's inheritance, and now, most damningly, an armed assault carried out inside a duke's own household against a woman under his explicit protection. It was, as Rowan had predicted, precisely the kind of scandal that no amount of Ashgrove's careful, practiced civility could survive once it reached the ears of a royal court that took a rather dim view of nobles who tried to murder their wives for financial gain. The legal proceedings that followed were swift, by the standards of noble courts, largely because Rowan's standing and reputation carried considerable weight, and because the physical evidence, a captured, confessing intruder chief among it, left very little room for Ashgrove's solicitors to construct any convincing defense. Within 6 weeks, the Crown granted Isadora a full and immediate annulment of her marriage, on grounds of attempted murder by her husband, along with formal legal protection guaranteeing her safety and independence going forward. Ashgrove himself was stripped of his title and his lands were seized by the Crown, a punishment considerably more severe than mere social disgrace, and one that ensured he would never again have the resources or influence to threaten Isadora's life. Her mother's inheritance, ironically, reverted to her regardless of the annulment's timing, the original 5-year condition rendered moot by the far more damning circumstances of the marriage's end. Isadora found herself, for the first time in her adult life, entirely her own woman, free of her father's debts, free of Ashgrove's cruelty, and in possession of land and resources sufficient to ensure she would never again be forced into a position where her survival depended on someone else's mercy. It was, by any reasonable measure, a happy ending already. And it would have been easy, at that point, for the story to simply end there. A broken woman, mended, made whole and free and safe, walking away from Crestfall with newfound independence and a grateful heart toward the Duke who had saved her. But that is not, in fact, what happened. Because somewhere in those 6 weeks of legal proceedings, watching Rowan fight for her with the same tireless, patient determination he brought to every broken thing he had ever refused to abandon, Isadora had come to understand something important about herself. That her freedom, hard-won and precious as it was, did not require her to walk away from the one person who had never once, in all their months together, made her feel like a burden, a project, or an obligation. It was Isadora, in the end, who raised the question neither of them had quite dared to voice since the night of the attack. Sitting once more in the room of mended things, the ceramic bird returned to its place of honor on the shelf where she had first found it. "I could leave now," she said quietly, watching Rowan's face carefully for his reaction. "I have the resources to start a new life anywhere I choose. I could take my mother's lands and build something entirely my own, far from any reminder of Edmund, far from anyone who might recognize me or gossip about what happened. That would be the sensible thing to do, probably. The clean break. A fresh start." Rowan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he said nothing, waiting, the way he always waited, for her to finish. "But I don't want that," Isadora continued. "I've spent this whole conversation trying to talk myself into wanting it, because I thought perhaps that was the brave, independent thing to do, to prove I don't need anyone, not even you, to build a life worth living. And then I realized that isn't bravery at all. It's just fear wearing a different disguise. The real bravery, I think, is choosing to stay somewhere with someone not because I have no other options, but because this castle, this room, this man who spent 13 years teaching himself that nothing broken is beyond saving, is genuinely where I want to be. Not out of obligation, out of love. Rowan crossed the room to her before she had even finished speaking, and when he kissed her this time, there was none of the careful restraint that had marked their earlier moments together. Only the full, unguarded relief of a man who had spent months terrified he was about to lose the one thing his entire collection of broken, mended treasures had somehow, impossibly, been building toward all along. They were married in the spring, in a small ceremony held in the gardens of Crestfall rather than the grand cathedral in the capital that tradition might have suggested for a duke's wedding. A choice both of them made without a moment's hesitation, because grand cathedrals had never felt like either of their story, and the gardens, blooming and alive after a long winter, felt considerably more honest. Mrs. Abernathy cried through the entire ceremony, unashamedly, and told anyone who would listen afterward that she had known, from the very first week, that something remarkable was growing between the Duke and the strange, careful woman he'd pulled from a ditch, though she was gracious enough not to say so quite so directly to either of them at the time. Master Hale, who had tended Isadora through that first uncertain fever, gave a toast at the small wedding feast that made half the household weep, speaking of broken things and second chances with the particular eloquence of a man who had spent his whole career watching bodies heal and understanding, better than most, how rarely healing happens on schedule and how precious it is when it happens at all. Isadora wore, at her own insistence, a simple dress rather than an elaborate gown. Pale blue, the color, she told Rowan privately, of the sea just before a storm breaks, though this time the storm was long past and what remained was only the calm, clear beauty of what came after. In her hair, instead of jewels, she wore a small ornament that Rowan had made himself over the preceding weeks, quietly, in the evenings after she had gone to bed. A delicate wire and gold filigree recreation of a small, cracked bird, its fracture line deliberately left visible rather than hidden, a tribute to the very first gift he had ever given her, and to everything that gift had come, in the months since, to represent. They spent their wedding night not in some elaborate bridal chamber but in the room of mended things, at Isadora's request, surrounded by every broken, careful, precious object Rowan had spent 13 years refusing to let the world discard. And it was there, among the shelves of teacups and violins and stopped clocks, that Isadora finally understood the full shape of the promise Rowan had made her that very first day, when he had told her that everything could be mended, even when it didn't. Feel that way. I used to think this room was strange, she admitted, curled against him as candlelight flickered across the familiar shelves. All these broken things, kept instead of thrown away. I understand it now, though. I understand why you couldn't let any of it go. And why is that? Rowan asked, though he suspected, from the softness in her voice, that he already knew the answer. Because every broken thing in this room, Isadora said, is proof that something survived. That damage isn't the end of a story. It's just the part where the story gets interesting, where you find out whether the thing or the person is worth the trouble of saving. You proved that to me, Rowan, before you ever said a single word about love. You proved it every single day, just by refusing to give up on me the way everyone else in my life had already given up. Rowan pressed a kiss to the top of her head, holding her close, surrounded by the strange and beautiful evidence of 13 years spent believing, against every discouragement his father had ever offered him, that nothing was ever truly beyond mending. You were never the most broken thing I ever found, Isadora, he said quietly. You were simply the first one I ever really wanted to keep. Everything else in this room, I mended because I couldn't bear to see it wasted. I mended because I couldn't bear the thought of a world without you in it. There's a difference, and I think it's the most important difference I've ever learned. Years later, long after this story might otherwise have ended, the Duchess of Crestfall. For that is what Isadora became and remained, for the rest of a long and considerably happier life than the one she had once believed possible. Added her own contribution to the room of mended things, a tradition that would continue for the rest of their marriage, each of them slowly filling those shelves not just with objects rescued from ruin, but with a shared philosophy about what it meant to love something or someone through every stage of its breaking and its healing. Their own children, when they came, grew up wandering those same shelves the way Isadora once had, learning early and thoroughly that nothing in their parents' house was ever thrown away simply because it had cracked or torn or stopped working the way it used to. They learned, too, the story behind the small ceramic bird that occupied the shelf of honor nearest the door. The very first gift their father had given their mother, offered wordlessly on an afternoon neither parent ever tired of retelling, each time adding some small new detail that made the story feel, somehow, freshly remarkable with every version. The village below Crestfall's cliffs eventually stopped whispering about the Duke's strange habits, not because he stopped collecting broken things, he never did, not for the rest of his life, but because the whispers had, over the years, transformed into something closer to respect. The workshop Cecilia had once suggested he open, all those years before Isadora ever arrived at his gates, finally came into being, funded and championed by Isadora herself, who understood better than almost anyone alive exactly how much it could mean to a person to have somewhere to bring the broken things in their life, objects and otherwise, and be told, gently, patiently, that they were still worth the trouble of saving. People traveled from considerable distances, in the years that followed, to visit that workshop, and more than a few of them left not just with a mended teacup or a repaired violin, but with something considerably harder to measure. A sense, however small, that they too might be worth mending whatever damage life had done to them along the way. Rowan never turned anyone away, no matter how hopeless their broken belongings seemed, no matter how long the repair might take. He had learned that lesson too well, too completely, ever to forget it again. And on quiet evenings, long after the workshop had closed for the day and the household had settled into its familiar rhythms, the Duke and Duchess of Crestfall could still be found, more often than not, in that same room where their story had truly begun. Surrounded by teacups and violins and stopped clocks, by a small blackened stub of wood that had once been a wooden horse, by a shattered blue bowl mended with careful gold seams that made its fractures more beautiful than the original piece had ever been. Two people who had each, in their own way, been thrown away by someone who should have loved them better, who had found each other instead on a storm-lashed cliff road, and who had spent every year since proving, patiently and thoroughly, that the old Duke's lesson had been wrong all along. Broken things are not worthless. Broken people are not beyond saving. And sometimes, if you are patient enough and careful enough and brave enough to risk your own heart in the mending, you discover that the thing you saved was saving you right back the entire time in ways you never quite expected and never, for a single moment, regretted. That is the story of the Duke of Crestfall, who collected broken things his entire life, and of Duchess Isadora, who was never really the most broken thing he ever found, only the first one and the only one he ever truly needed to mend. If the story moved you, stay a while longer. There are more tales like this one waiting, of broken people finding their way back to whole, and I would be glad of your company for the next one too.